Actually, we are very punctual for certain things. Bullfights and masses always start on time, and this is the closest that we're going to get to either one of those during this time that we're here together. So I think that all of you should have one of these orders of evening worship, and if you don't have one already by now, then try to secure one or cozy up to somebody that has one. Is there anybody here who is brave enough to try a couple of hymns playing the piano? If not, we can sing a cappella. So we can. So do I see a brave hand going up, accompanied by the bass or clef hand also? No? Nadie? See? Oh, good. Dos. That's wonderful. Did you see the two? One is very familiar. The other is yeah, and that's it has one. Let us all now pause for a moment and be in the spirit of prayer. Our opening prayer is one written by Ignatius of Loyola in the 16th century. Let us all pray together. Teach us, good Lord, to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for any reward except that of knowing that we do your will. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You may stand if you wish for the singing of this hymn for the healing of the nations. It's a very well-known tune, and the words are relatively new.
For the healing of the nations, Lord, we pray with one accord, for a just and equal sharing of the things that earth affords, through a life of love in action, help us rise and pledge our word. Help us rise and pledge our word. Lead us forward into freedom, from despair your world release, that redeemed from war and hatred, all may come and go in peace. Show us how through care and goodness, fear will die and hope increase. Fear will die and hope increase. All that gives abundant living, let it from the earthly bed. Pride of Savior's rays o'er ruling, darkness and obscure your plan. In our common quest for justice, may we hallow life's respan. May we hallow life's respan. You Creator God have written your great name on humankind. For our growing in your likeness, bring the life of Christ to mind. That light of response and service, earth its destiny may find. Earth its destiny may find.
Please be seated. What I have sought in putting these prayers and hymns together this evening is to capture what I think is the spirit of this gathering here, and to give it a little bit of a Latin American or Hispanic perspective, the hymn for the healing of the nations, I think, helps us to relativize our own personal pride of nation, but at the same time to commit ourselves to that vision which is so clearly, I believe, so clearly present in the poems and in the words of the scripture. The second prayer that we have this evening was written by Ruben Alves, who's a personal friend of our speaker tonight, and who has been a lecturer here also at the School of Theology at least twice that I can remember. Let us all pray this together. O God, just as the disciples heard Christ's words of promise and began to eat the bread and drink the wine in the suffering of a long remembrance and in the joy of a hope, grant that we may hear your words spoken in each thing of everyday affairs. Coffee on our table in the morning, the simple gesture of opening a door to go out free, the shouts of children in the parks, a familiar song sung by an unfamiliar face, a friendly tree that has not yet been cut down. May simple things speak to us of your mercy and tell us that life can be good. And may these sacramental gifts make us remember those who do not receive them, who have their lives cut every day in the bread absent from the table, in the door of the hospital, the prison, the welfare home that does not open, in sad children, feet without shoes, eyes without hope, in war hymns that glorify death, in deserts where once there was life. Christ was also sacrificed, and may we learn that we participate in the saving sacrifice of Christ when we participate in the suffering of his little ones. Amen. Our closing hymn is a Latin American hymn by Miguel Manzanos and Olivar. It's entitled Cuando el Pobre. I invite you to sing at least one of the stanzas in Spanish, and then you can sing others in other languages that may be in whichever language may be easier for you. I believe that hymns are extremely important. I think that we, especially those of us who preach, ought to have the humility to recognize that when people remember our worship services, chances are that they'll remember the hymns far more than they'll remember the brilliance of our sermons. That when you have wonderful words accompanied by beautiful notes and rhythms and pauses and intensities, etc., that those words go a lot deeper than even the most brilliant of our metaphors. So even the great dictators of the world, especially of Latin America, learned this when they recognized that Joan Baez was coming into South America, and they permitted her to say anything she wanted, but they did not permit her to sing. So knowing this, let us all stand and sing Cuando el Pobre, when the poor ones.
Cuando el pobre nada tiene y aún reparte, cuando el hombre pasa sed y agua nos da, cuando el débil a su hermano fortalece, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. Va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo Cuando sufre un hombre y logra su consuelo. Cuando espera y no se cansa de esperar. Cuando amamos aunque el odio nos rodee. Va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. Va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. When our joy fills up our cup to overflowing, when our lips can speak no words other than true, when we know that love for simple things is better, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. When our homes are filled with goodness in abundance, when we learn how to make peace instead of wars, when each stranger that we meet is called a neighbor, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar.
Please be seated. In introducing our speakers this evening, I have the advantage that by now most of us have heard from each other, and so I don't have to take their time away from their presentations and make long speeches about them. Our main presenter this evening will be Dr. Joel Gajardo, who is originally from Chile, and whom I had the pleasure and honor of meeting in 1972 in Santiago at the first meeting of Christians toward Socialism. Joel was one of the organizers of that event and had already been engaged in the process of liberation and in the engagement of the church in the process of liberation in Latin America. And as he told you this morning, he has been living in exile, first in a forced way, and then later on, even though he has been permitted to come back, still life is not as easy when you have had the kind of record that he has had for speaking on behalf of the powerless. I could just name an incredible amount of events in which he has participated, and of course you already were introduced to his great eloquence. So you're in for a treat as you hear him tonight speaking to us on this, on the topic of how, as a Latin American, and especially more as a Chilean, how he expects us to see the participation of Latin Americans in the creating of a new consciousness, Christian consciousness in the Pacific Basin. The respondent will be Dr. Hall from Montreal, who already explained that he was 3,000 miles away from the Pacific and yet qualified to be here, for Canada has indeed two literals and not just one. And it'll be great to hear him as a respondent. The third person who will speak to us, actually before Joel comes forth, will be Julia Matsui Estrella, I would say, but I have also heard Estrella, so whichever way. Where are you, Julia or Julia? Estrella, okay, or Estrella? Estrella, okay. And Julia is here to tell us a little bit about the another movement or another group that met in Hilo last year. I had hoped to be one of the linkages for that. I had been invited, and unfortunately I could not make it. But I'm glad that Julia is here, or Julia is here, to make us all aware of what is going on at that other level as well. I'm sorry to disappoint those of you who thought that I had dressed up like this for this event tonight. I actually had to dress this way because this evening Our church has been nominated for a Legacy Award, and tonight is when those Legacy Awards will be announced at the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood. And I persuaded a lay person, the chair of our administrative council, to go to the dinner. And I said, look, I know that I'll make it on time for the presentations of the awards. And if we do get the award, then I'll make the speech for the thanking people for that award. So I have a lay person right now who's sweating it out, hoping that I can get there on time. I guess maybe half hoping we don't get the award. But I have been assured that we're going to be quite pleased at the end of this evening. So I'm going to take my leave after this, and I'll have to appear halfway decent at this event over there. So it is now my pleasure to then call Julia, and after that, Joel will be here. I just forgot to add one thing that is extremely important. The most important thing about Joel Gajardo is through these years, we have managed to stay friends, and that's quite a big thing for the both of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio. Good evening, and thank you to the planners for giving me this opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes about the Pacific Ecumenical Forum. But before I do so, I need to also let you know where I come from. I have a long name, Julia Matsui, Keiko Matsui Higa, Australia. And this is really the Pacific Rim, because my mother is from Okinawa, and she came to Hawaii as a picture bride, and as a domestic worker, and as a worker in the plantations of the sugar and pineapple fields. And she's 92 years old and lives with me today in Berkeley. My father was from Hiroshima, and I was born and raised in Hawaii, and my husband is from the Philippines. So when you say the Pacific Rim and Basin, I think we encompass, as a family, the Pacific Rim and Basin. I was very honored to be a participant in the Pacific Ecumenical Forum in December of 1990 in Hilo, Hawaii. And to give you a little bit of background, some of us on the West Coast ecumenical workings had heard Roy Sano, who was teaching at Pacific School of Religion, talk 10 years ago about how the 21st century is the century of the Pacific. And the fact that today, in this day and age, there's twice as much traffic from the U.S. crossing the Pacific than there is from the U.S. to the Atlantic attests to the new realities of today. But Roy was talking about this 10 years ago. And so the West Coast Ecumenical Councils had been trying to figure out a way to form a partnership with the Christian Conference of Asia and the Pacific Conference of Churches. But we didn't quite have the staff or the imagination at that point to figure out how to do that. But about 2 years ago, Ron Fujiyoshi, who at that time had been pushed out of Japan for siding with the Korean minorities and refusing fingerprinting, had basically been pushed out of Japan and was looking for something to do. And so he was approached to be co-opted as a board for World Ministries of United Church of Christ to give us staff time to see if we could indeed link up the whole Pacific region, Asia, the Pacific Basin, and the west coast of the Americas, including Alaska, Canada, US, Mexico, and South America, and Central America. So this was a major endeavor, and we didn't know whether it could be done. But I think Ron was a right person for this because he had worked in the Pacific, wider Pacific, for over 25 years, and I think had built up the credibility with people in the basin as well as the rim. So for 2 years, there was serious organizing to bring together this tripartite alliance. And December in Hilo was the bringing together of equal representation from 3 of these regions. We didn't want any group or sector to be dominating, and we were especially concerned about North America. So we were trying especially to understand the dynamics of the Pacific region. So the conference called together 33 delegates from Asia. Delegates were picked by the Christian Conference of Asia. 33 delegates were picked by the Pacific Conference of Churches for the Pacific Islands, including Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Those are the three main groupings. And from the west coast of the Americas, this was very difficult because there's not one body, except maybe the National Council of Churches, but that doesn't represent all of the Americas. So we really did have a problem trying to figure out how to bring together this part of the rim to the table when we had CCA, or Christian Conference of Asia, Pacific Conference of Churches, and this glob over here, which went all the way from Alaska to South America. So approximately 100 people got together in Hilo for 2 weeks, and the purpose was to build trust, because we had never met before together as people from the wider Pacific. So one of the main purposes was to begin to build trust between these three regions by telling stories, by sharing stories. And one of the interesting things as we began to share stories, that there was a common theme, and that was suffering. And primarily, and from all of these sectors, and especially from the women, the stories of suffering. Another goal, in addition to sharing stories in order to build trust, was to begin to identify issues that we can work in solidarity together on, and to also begin to build some strategies. After we identified some of the issues, we wanted to have some idea of at least the groundwork for strategies. When we left Hilo, we had our proceedings. It wasn't published at that time. It has been published in the last 2 months. But this is available on the table outdoors. I didn't bring many copies because it was pretty heavy. I brought some books as well. But for some of you who would like to pick up these copies, this is the proceedings of the Pacific Ecumenical Forum. In addition to this, we have a videotape which was made professionally by Avako in Japan, which is a 30-minute video which summarizes the proceedings of the conference. And I think it's a very good educational tool that is available through your region, through CCA, PCC, or from any of us who are on the West Coast Ecumenical Councils. We left Hilo with what we call a continuation committee. Basically, we said that in order for us to continue our work, we needed some loose alliance steering committee. And we call ourselves a consultative committee or a continuation committee. And at this point, we're still in the evolution stage. We have 3 people from CCA on the consultative committee, 3 from the Pacific Conference of Churches, and 2 from North America, because we were afraid of the domination factor. Although it's actually 3, because National Council of Churches does come as an actor in the whole situation. So we actually do have 3 from the Americas. We are trying to get Canada and South America to also become a part of this table. But then I think the Americas would be too heavy. So we really have to figure out how we evolve the next stages of our consultative committee. One of the first projects that we are planning as a Pacific Ecumenical Forum is to lift up the voices of the women in the Marshall Islands. As someone mentioned, 66 atomic bombs by the U.S. have been dropped on the Marshall Islands from 1946 to about 1957. And the book that I had outdoors called Day of Two Suns documents how the U.S. used the Marshall Island people as guinea pigs to see what the atomic radiation would do. And part of the scientific prediction was that 40 years after this testing, jellyfish babies would soon appear, 40 years. And sure enough, 40 years later, jellyfish babies are part of the Marshall Island picture. So one of our first activities is to send a group of women from each of the regions to Ibai in the Marshall Islands, where the jellyfish babies are being born, as a sign of solidarity, a sign of linking issues, and we hope that the people who are sent from the different regions will have similar solidarity struggles to link up with. And we're thinking, for example, from North America, we would like to send 2 Mexican-American workers who have children who are deformed because of the toxic pesticides that they have to work with as farm workers. So these are the kinds of linkages that we are trying to make through some of the ongoing activities of the forum. I don't want to be too long, so therefore I just wanted to lay it out there to let you know that there is a tripartite alliance called the Pacific Ecumenical Forum. It is not without problems, because as you know, it's hard to communicate, and it's expensive to communicate, and it's hard to keep those communication lines open. So it is not without problems, but I think it's also a very exciting new movement, and I think that we need to begin to work across borders and in solidarity. And I would like to ask at this time if the planners will allow me to have just one question, because I don't like to speak without some feedback or some question. So if you would allow me to have at least one interaction with at least one person who have a question, I would appreciate it very much. Is there any question at all in terms of where we are as a Pacific Ecumenical Forum? We have a book called Dragons in Distress, which I like to bring with me. And this one is for Dr. Yongbwa Kim, because I promised him on Monday night when he spoke in Berkeley. And he said this book was not radical enough, but it's pretty radical because it basically talks about the so-called four dragons or tigers of Asia, which is Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And this is a book that the World Bank was afraid that it would get published because it basically pokes holes in this wonderful propaganda that these are miracle economies. And what Walden Bellow and Stephanie Rosenfeld do is that they show how these miracle economies exist at the great cost of the environment and of the workers and of the grassroots people. So this is a really excellent book to begin cutting your teeth on in terms of what's happening in the four dragons or the four tigers. So, any questions? Or did I cover the subject so well that, okay, one question right here. Okay, on the table, we're getting people involved in regions because we have to, as we know, think globally and act locally. So each region has their own organizing network, and we in Northern California have a brochure and a flyer on the table, and it invites you to join our network so that you will receive our newsletters and our invitations to upcoming conferences and let you know about the various solidarity visitations that will be continuing. Thank you very much.
I know that many of you are quite disappointed that Gustavo Gutierrez is not with us this evening. I'm also disappointed. We are a very good friend, and I was talking to some of the colleges noon time, and I remember vividly that we met for the first time in a meeting of ISAL, Church and Society in Latin America, in 1961. So it's exactly 30 years ago when we started working together and dreaming about some things, and he has been able to concretize much more things than I have, but I'm very fond of my friendship with Gustavo Gutierrez and others. And that reminds me of a little story. There was a famous theologian, that was giving different lectures around, and it was always very well received. And he has a faithful driver because he take advantage of rehearse, just relax or whatever, in his car. So this driver was always going around and, of course, park the car, go and sit in the auditorium and listen to the lecture. So on one occasion, the driver said, Professor, I've been with you for so long that I know your lecture by heart. And I bet that I can give you a lecture as well as you can. And the professor said, that's interesting. What about changing roles then? The next time that I'm invited to give my lecture, I will put your kind of uniform as a driver. You can dress up as a professor and go and give the lecture. I say, well, I'm ready for that game. So they did that. As soon as they arrived to a place, the professor put the uniform as a driver, and the driver put a kind of professor dressed and went on and delivered the lecture. Everything was wonderful. No fault, no problems. But then he finished a little bit earlier, and there was some time for question and answers. And then somebody from the audience said, well, Professor, you have been very kind, and your lecture is most enlightening. I would like to know if you have any opinion about the real great contribution of the Cappadocian Fathers to the doctrine of the Trinity. So the driver stopped for a minute and looked and said, do you think that is a very interesting question? That is a very simple, and excuse me, but even almost dumb question. You know? And to prove it, I would not dare to answer that. I will ask my driver to come and answer for you. Well, my friend, the driver is not here tonight. So we will just do the best that we can. According to some historians, when Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spaniard that was in Panama, moved overland and saw for the first time the great expansion of blue, wonderful water in the other side of the country, he saw it so blue, calm, and soothing that there was no doubt in his mind, this is going to be the Pacific Ocean. I wonder if Vasco Núñez de Balboa will be able to come back to Panama and to cross the Isthmus, if he will have a different word, not only for describing what he was seeing at the moment, but also what he have seen in the process of moving from one side of Panama to the other. And I also wonder if you and I could do the trip, what type of word will describe what we have seen? How we will describe the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific Basin of Rim today? In the same way that Vasco Núñez de Balboa made a quick and permanent decision on a moment of observation, because after all, the Pacific Ocean is not always Pacific, as I'm sure some of you have realized in your own experience. But so we do today. In many cases, following suit, will make some kind of great assumptions and final decision based in a quick, momentary reality. Unfortunately, this is all too common attitude in our world, both in the personal and societal situation. We are quick to judge even more. We have many prejudgment, preconception, prejudices, stereotypes. We have a lot of labels to put on peoples and on situations. Apparently in our world we need labels in order to understand the world the easy way. That is, without real commitment, no serious thought, no feedback or interpersonal relationships. If we can read a label, then we know what is behind the label. And even there are some people in our world today that are willing to create labels, to provide them for us for our consumption. So we don't need even to make them up. We just receive them, stamp it on the people, and we know what kind of people, what type of situation, what type of country we are dealing with. But as we also know, labels are almost always misleading. They reveal, but at the same time conceal something that is important. Revealing and concealing. Yes, we need to search. Nowadays, we are encouraged in the North American situation to read the labels very carefully in order to find out what is in the product. And now even they're saying, well, it's not enough to read the labels. You need to have a key of interpretation. You know, what is in different aliments or things, that, you know, food that you are buying. Well, I hope that that spirit of inquisitiveness is with us, because we are here in this conference in order to go beyond superficialities, beyond the labels that we have received from Madison Avenue or from any other place. We are here in order to identify for ourselves the real issues, the real problems that we are facing as inhabitants of the Pacific Rim. We need to go beyond the stereotypes that have been so pervasive in our society that for too long has kind of create a cliche of our areas, of our islands, of our countries, our peoples, and our culture, religion, and vision. We are here to search with all seriousness for a closer approximation to the reality, a reality that is marked by its vastness and complexity, where the sea, the land, the people, the sky, the wind, the surf, the trees, the fish, the old, the new, the traditional, the unexpected, the calm and the fury, the high, the low, the many and the few, the rich and the poor, the past and the present, all these and more ingredients are coming together in the hope of creating a different future for the Pacific realm and also for the world. It looks like, if we will take our job seriously, it's much too big for our strength. But at the same time, we will never know about real strength until we attempt to do something. So here we are, ready to start, to continue and to move beyond easy stereotypes and commonalities, common sayings, in order to find out what is actually happened in the different parts of the world that we represent, and that together make up the Pacific Basin or the Pacific Rim. The first thing that is quite evident when we start doing a serious research is that in spite of distances and relative isolation, the search for unity is not something new in the Pacific Rim. It's something that has been present for a long, long time. And I don't want to make a long story at this point because we don't have the time. But certainly it will be good to remember that, for instance, as early as 1950, it was created what is known as the Colombo Plan. And this was created in order to promote development of newly independent Asian member countries. The stated aim of the Colombo Plan is, and I quote, to promote interest in and support for the economic and social development in Asia and the Pacific, to keep under review economic and social progress in the region, and help accelerate development through cooperative effort, and C, to facilitate development assistance to and within the region. The Colombo Plan was started in a modest way. 7 Commonwealth nations, newly independent, decided to start it. But at this point in history, it's flourishing, and it has 26 different nations as members of the plan, including big ones: Canada, the US, Japan, the United Kingdom, Australia, India, and many others. We are also aware of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, regional organization formed by the government of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand through the Bangkok Declaration signed in August 8 of 1967. Again, the main theme, the main concern of this association is economic growth, social progress, cultural development, multicultural
and mutual cooperation. The South Pacific Forum is another organization that is trying to give concrete unity to the countries of the Asian and South Pacific. The thrive, the search for unity has been also present in Latin America, as being one of the longest dreams of the Latin American nations. Maybe some of you have heard that already Simon Bolivar, or Simón Bolívar, as we call him in Spanish, dreamed in a letter written from exile in Jamaica in the early 19th century, I do have a vision that someday we'll be able to create in Latin America La Patria Grande, the big country, a country that will not recognize frontiers, borders, but is going to work for the unification and prosperity of the people. In 1821, when the newly independent nations of Central America tried to create their own internal government, it was led by Francisco de Morazán, a real patriot and a visionary that pushed for the creation of the Confederation of Central American Countries that worked well for more than a decade, but finally succumbed under the influence of both internal and external pressures. The dream of a united Latin America has been present for a long, long time. Sometimes in a very genuine desire for the Latin American people themselves, in other cases kind of pressed by the neighbor of the North, the US. In April 14, 1890, in Washington, D.C., for the first time, the different Latin American countries sent delegates in order to see how they can express the unity that they supposed to be looking for. This was the beginning of the Pan American Union. Different problems make it impossible for the Pan American Union to really be built. Mostly the war between the US and Spain in the late part of the century, last century, and then the First War, and then other problems, until after the Second World War, the Pan American Union was transformed in the Organization of American States, OAS. Again, the aims of this unity in Latin America: peace and justice, American solidarity, economic development, cultural recognition. There have been many attempts in Latin America to organize regional organizations. For instance, the Andean Pact is one organization to express the common interest of the Andean countries. There is another that is called the Latin American Integration Association, LAIA. There is another that is LAFTA, and I can name many others in the total Latin American context or regionally. For instance, the Central American Common Market, created in 1960, apparently is a good idea in order to give expression to the unity of Central America. Unfortunately, this was not a genuine program dreamed and carried out by Central American, but rather it was a common market created by multinational corporations in order to make fair distribution of their assets in the region. And instead of dealing with one individual country, they were dealing with the total group of, in those days, maybe 12 million Central American people. There are many other international efforts, but this will suffice in order to recognize that the dream of a united world is not something that is alien, but is very much part and parcel of the way that we human beings have been conducting our business in the world. The common theme that we have seen in these conferences, these meetings, were clearly established economic growth, social progress, cultural development, mutual cooperation. I think that this is very important for us to recognize, because there is not much difference if people are living in Asia in the Pacific or in Latin America in the Pacific. We are bound not only by the same ocean, by the same waters, but also we are bound by the same desire of expressing our life in a more meaningful way. The contemporary reality that we face in our world and particularly in our area of concern, can be characterized in the following manner. Geographic separation, great distances, kind of a space is an important element, and we were reminded this morning about this. But in spite of distances and space, the desire for unity is there. We also recognize in this region a tremendous amount of natural wealth. There are natural resources available either for the people that inhabit those places or for some external forces that are willing to take advantage of the goodness of the land, the goodness of the sea. The sea is a very important element, and we need to be reminded time and time again that the Pacific Ocean is almost half the surface of the earth. It's almost double the size of the Atlantic Ocean. And now we know that there are many good things, minerals and others, in the bottom of the ocean. The United Nations has been concerned with the law of the sea that will save, the ocean from pollution. There was one serious impediment to passing the law of the sea. The United States was unwilling to sign the law of the sea. The same has been the case with the possibilities of reaching an agreement about the Antarctic, the peaceful use of the Antarctic soil, and also the no proliferation or the no contamination of the Antarctic area. The United States, again, will not sign any treaty in this direction. We know why. Our United States corporation, the only one that either have or can develop the technology that will allow them to explore the bottom of the sea and also the bottom, the real land of the Antarctic continent that is covered by ice. Yes, we do have a reality that on one side gives us the possibility of wealth and well-being, and the other the possibility of extreme exploitation and the marginalization of the people that are related to those resources. We are glad about the new connections that can cover the space and the distances in the Pacific Rim. Modern transportation make possible trips, and we were again reminded just recently that twice as much trips are going on at this point in the Pacific than in the Atlantic. Seems not too far ago when the Atlantic was the real center. 500 years of Atlantic domination are coming to an end, and now the Pacific already is here to stay, and most probably the announced reality of the 21st century has been the century of the Pacific Rim is becoming a reality. But these new connections can bring peace, development, and stability, but also can bring kind of a lot of unrestfulness, problems for our lands. I think that we need to be mindful of the shrinking of our world, the real global village in which we are living, that bring us together for good or evil, and much depend on our own ability to stick together, to stand together in order to defend our rights and to protect what is ours in order to be used for the common good and not for the enrichment of few corporations and few people. We see a tremendous opportunity for an open trade and economic development if we know how to play our cards right, if we can keep under check those forces that want to exploit, the wealth for their own sake. So again, vigilance is something that is called for. We need to be careful about protecting the integrity not only of our land and our oceans, but also the integrity of our people, the working class, those who have been abused for so long, the natives, the women. We need to be careful about the exploitation of tourism and the corollary of prostitution that could come all over the Pacific Rim. We are seeing some of these issues already, and we need to eradicate them and to prevent their preservation in the region. And how can we forget, or not to mention at this point, the ecological issues? Yes, we are all mindful of how easy it is to pollute what has been preserved clean for so long. We are certainly aware and painfully aware of the nuclear explosions in the Pacific. I've been involved in several consultations in Japan and other areas about a nuclear-free South Pacific or Pacific Rim. We can talk and talk, but so far we cannot materialize any serious commitment of those countries that really possess the ability, the possibility of contaminating the atmosphere with nuclear waste. But it's not only nuclear, the most radical way of expressing this pollution. We do have the contamination that is coming through pesticide and fertilizer, even some elements that are forbidden in the United States or some so-called developed countries in Europe are easily shipped to some of the Pacific Islands and the Latin American countries, because after all, in those places, the belief is that life is cheap and disposable. So we can experiment, only that this is becoming a boomerang, because the same type of forbidden pesticides in the United States that have been sold to Guatemala are coming back to us because Guatemala is producing broccoli and other goodies that we are eating, from buying from our stores. So although we want to contaminate there, we are also coming back with our own problems. Yes, we need to be more serious about how we do business with the rest of the world, and particularly with the Pacific Basin. The geopolitical situation is another aspect that is of great interest. We need to be aware of that, because if not, we are going to be easily used and misused by whatever big powers are around in the world. There was a very important consultation, the International Security Council Conference on Geopolitics of Security in the Greater Pacific Basin, that was held in Honolulu, Hawaii, in December of 1987. This consultation was a very important point in order to analyze what the big countries, and particularly what this big country, the United States, think about the situation of the Pacific Basin. I was really surprised reading the proceeding of this, because out of 11 presentations, 4 had to do with Latin American issues. And in the 80s, very few people would put together the South Pacific or the Asian Pacific and the Latin American part, but the Security Council already was quite advised and wise about the situation there. Part of the final declaration of this consultation expresses the following, and I quote, "An INF agreement has been signed in Washington by the US and the USSR. Unfortunately, this does not change the realities of the superpower rivalry on both shores of the Pacific Basin. The illusion of the ending of the Soviet threat it endangers may leave the countries of the Pacific Basin more vulnerable to Soviet-sponsored, Soviet-supported, low-intensity conflict, subversion, and terrorism." I underline this word, low-intensity conflict, subversion, and terrorism. The Soviet Union was going to be involved in this, not the US. No, of course not. Now, the document speaks again of the proliferation of radical regimes, Cuba, Nicaragua, and North Korea, as representing, and I quote, "an additional challenge to the security interests of the countries of the region," not of the US, but the countries of the region. Soviet policies, the anti-American nationalism presently on the rise among nations of South American Pacific coast is also a serious concern for us. And the document goes on saying, beside the threat to US international lines of communication, the subversion on Central American neighbors, and the basing opportunities for these allies provides Moscow, the Cuban-Nicaraguan axis poses a major challenge to Mexico. Not to the United States, but to Mexico. Mexico is the one that is in trouble. And then the last quote from this document, the Soviet strategic purpose in Panama, now we move south a little bit, is clear. The permanent removal of the US presence in that country by or before the end of the century. The accomplishment of this objective is far advanced, 1987, far advanced, and poses a serious additional threat to US and Western vital interests in the next century, if not before. Countries that were named in 1987. Nicaragua is a threat. The situation has changed in Nicaragua. Now it's a friendly country and we can ignore it. Panama, Noriega is in a jail in Miami, living fairly well, being well treated, but still 20,000 people have been dislocated in Panama. Several hundred, if not thousands, were killed in the invasion, but then the Soviet threat is over. What are they going to do now that the Soviet Union has practically disappeared, where communism is not a real threat to anybody, anywhere in the world? I'm sure that they are working very hard, day and night, in order to fight another enemy that will justify this type of nonsense in order to maintain the hegemonic power in an area that certainly doesn't correspond to them. So we are very much aware that from the strategic point of view, the Pacific Rim is perceived as extremely important by the United States, and I'm sure that by any other country. If Japan will become an hegemonic power, no doubt that this area is going to be strategically super important for this country. So we are in the midst of a very tense situation. Let me just move a little bit from this kind of strategic importance of Latin America to the situation in Latin America itself, as part of my presentation this evening. Latin America has yet to be free. We celebrate independence from Spain, but that didn't mean much for the majority of the people in the continent. Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan historian and economist, has written a famous book called Open Veins of Latin America. And he shows very clearly in his book that the history of Latin America is a history of dependence and exploitation. Spain, Portugal, England, the US. The name of the country that the powerful friend has changed, but the reality in Latin America remained the same. The occupation of Latin America has been done in different ways. Physical control by Spain and Portugal, physical invasion by the United States at certain points, although that has diminished, not disappeared, unfortunately, because we still have in recent time Grenada and Panama. But by and far, the situation is more settled. We do have more control of people that are part of governments. The United States has been exercising a tremendous amount of influence through puppet governments in different countries, government by proxies. So we do have some elections in Latin America in the past and in the present, but that doesn't mean that the situation has changed radically inside. Democracy is more than just voting for somebody, particularly when no real alternative is offered to the people in a given country. But maybe the most important way in which the United States is exercising its interventionist policies in Latin America is through economic pressure. And I'm going to kind of analyze that a little bit later. But the situation changed in Latin America after the Second War. There was a treaty signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1945 that is called euphemistically Mutual Assistance Defense Pact. Like we are going to defend each other. Like my country, Chile, is going to defend the United States, if something happened, to you. And we know that this is kind of a facade in order to allow the training of the military personnel in U.S. military establishment, in the School of the Americas in Panama, Fort Bragg, and other places here in the continental United States. But the Rio Treaty and other treaties that were signed after were very much, the result of the war and the Cold War that was the aftermath of the war. And therefore, the main tenet of some of these treaties was we need to be concerned with the enemy because the enemy is outside. The enemy is the Soviet Union and the so-called socialist communist countries. Things were very much under control with this program. But then something happened in 1959. The Cubans came, or the Cuban Revolution did happen. In a very real sense, the history of Latin America can be divided between AC and BC, before Castro and after Castro, or before Cuba and after Cuba, if you are less personal than that. But there is no doubt that the history of Latin America has been quite different since the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution aroused a lot of hope for the poor and oppressed in the continent, a lot of fear in the elites of the continent, and a tremendous uneasiness in the part of the empire of power in the United States. Soon, the role of the armed forces was radically changed inside the Americas. If before, from 1945 to 59, they were ready to kind of stop a foreign invasion, at this point they were ready to control internal subversion. And this is a very important step that did happen in this country and in Latin America in the early 60s, when the armed forces began to kind of expand their horizons. They did have a more meaningful role, not just looking out in kind of expectation of an enemy, but rather looking inside in order to identify those subversive forces that could transform, the peaceful societies of Latin America in kind of a revolutionary place like Cuba. Still, the Cold War rhetoric was kept. We heard a lot about East and West confrontations, but the reality was quite different. Now the enemy is inside. The enemy was part of the same people living in the country. This East-West confrontation was exacerbated in understanding the situation in Nicaragua, for instance. We never recognized that the Nicaraguan Sandinista government was something that was born out of the need of the people. That was the determination of the people. That was the empty stomachs of people in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, that were claiming for transformation, but rather was an East-West confrontation, was the provocation of the Soviet Union, the mingling of the Soviet Union in Latin American, Central American territories. By 1973, we did have 17 military governments in Latin America. Today, there is none. So we can welcome the so-called democratization of Latin America. But what has really changed in the reality of the people of Latin America? Practically nothing. And this is the real issue. We cannot rest assured with formalities. We need to go deeper and try to find out what is the situation of the people. And it is at this point where the economic weapons that the United States government and the multinational corporations of the world used against Latin America that are so important. This is a process not only of intervention, but also destabilization by any means, first economics, but if they fail, then kind of contra-wars or other are very legitimate used. The first move in the Latin American situation is the denial of funds, no economic aid to those countries that don't conform with the accepted policies of the United States. This can go from no aid to blockades, as in the case of Cuba and Nicaragua, to kind of the denial of loans, even to freeze some of the loans that are already in the pipeline on international financing organizations. The international banking system is at the service of this kind of tension with Latin America. In the first place, there was an easy access to credit. Latin American countries, particularly those who were considered prosperous and with potentialities for the future, were enticed to receive loans for development. because obviously the analysis was made in such a way that you are underdeveloped because you are poor. You are poor because you don't have money. Big discovery. Now, if you can borrow money, then you're going to be developed. And our countries, our elites, always eager to receive money from whatever sources is willing to lend, borrow and borrow. And in the famous and well-known phrases of Andre Gunther Frank, the economist, the only thing that was developed was underdevelopment. After decades of effort toward development, and after moving the foreign debts from 16 billion in 1970 to $500 billion in 1990, Latin America, according to the Economic Commission from Latin America of the United Nations, is where off today that it was 30 years ago. The growth of the foreign debt is something that is a heavy burden for all the Latin American countries. That's why in Argentina, the Catholic Church, one of the bishops more specifically, coined a famous phrase that in Spanish goes, Dios no quiere que la deuda externa sea eterna. That is, God doesn't want that the external debt become eternal debt. And I think that this is something that concerns us, and I'm sure that we are not alone in this situation, because the foreign debt expansion and concomitant austerity measure have created a classic confrontation between international financial institutions and the majority of the poor countries of the world, and particularly in Latin America. Our dealings with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, are classical example of the exploitation that is imposed in a given country in order to satisfy the need for money for those wealthy countries that can really lend to the poor for their own underdevelopment. The recommendations that are included in the shock treatment of the International Monetary Fund include the devaluation of the local currency that brings in inflation, wage freezes, that is less buying power for the working class, increased privatization, given all the possibilities for profit to the private capital, removal of tariff and any other protectionist measure. That means leaving open the country for the export of anything that the developed, industrialized countries want to import, and reduce government spending and employment, therefore increasing unemployment because the government cannot have a big bureaucracy, and also diminishing, any social services for the people. This has created such desperate situation in Latin America, as well as in Africa and in other countries, that the most affected people are women and children. The UNICEF has coined a special phrase. They call some of the children of debt. The debt is causing such a misery in our places that we cannot maintain our children. And this, of course, also reminds us of another problem that we face in Latin America, and this is our population growth. We are growing very rapidly. 20 years ago, the United States did have more population than the whole Latin American combined. Today, Latin America has almost double the population of the United States. And the trend is the same as we can foresee for the rest of this century. By the end of the century, demographers in the United Nations are predicting that Latin America will have about 650 million people. That is definitely too much. How we can control this? Certainly with better education. But my own conviction is that the best way of doing it will be to increase the real possibilities of physical, social well-being in our people, to assure people that they will have a security system at the end of their years, that they don't need necessarily too many children to take care of them, but that some way society is responsible for those who have been able to make a contribution to the well-being of the many. There are many social issues related to population growth. It's not only just preaching birth control or Planned Parenthood clinic. That is important, but it will not be enough if we want to make a real impact in the population growth. In order to pay the debt, our countries have been forced to an irrational exploitation of natural resources. The best case may be Brazil, cutting the forests in the Amazonian basin, doing a lot of things in order to kind of solve the problem that the debt is inflicting on them. Also, I think that the impact on ecology is clearly seen all over the place. Cutting trees, kind of digging out some of the mineral, regardless of the impact on the ecology and on people. So we do have to be mindful of these type of problems in the Latin American context. But as I said this, I'm very much aware that Latin America is not alone in the problem that we face. Similar conditions prevail in other Pacific countries: intervention, dependence, debt. Even in some countries that can count success stories, they have a heavy price to pay for the few successes that they can count. Unequal internal distribution of wealth is creating serious problems in those countries that are doing, at this point, fairly well with the free market economy system. There is a polarization increasing between the have and the have-not. This is not the use of old rhetoric. It's not trying to borrow from some ideologies that are dying. It's a way of describing what is actually happening in many of our countries, where the few have more and more, while the many have less and less. So we need to struggle for common solutions. This conference has been convened precisely to start dreaming, envisioning something that will give us the opportunity to do something together in a transnational way in order to implement measures that will create possibilities for a better future for us and for others. We need to take advantage of the new realities of the world in order to create a vision that is daring and realistic at the same time. We are experiencing the end of the Cold War. What is the meaning of that? What is the real possibility that the end of Cold War will bring for us? Can we do something good about it? Because certainly it can be used for the wrong. We cannot allow just one country to be unilaterally powerful, to exercise hegemonic power around the world. That could happen. The end of the Cold War maybe facilitated the intervention in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, and maybe could facilitate the intervention in other areas of the world without any balance to check the power, the military power of the United States. I think there is at this moment an ideological freedom that can really help to search for alternatives, not between socialism and capitalism, but to be more creative about the new thing that need to be born in order to do justice to the aspiration of the people. In Latin America, the role of the church, the role of the Christian community has been an ambivalent one. We always kind of are between the real prophetic activity of the church or the real opportunistic approach of the church. Sometimes the church can be prophetic, but in other cases it's just taking advantage of an historical juncture that allowed the church to say something that will not be able to maintain if the conditions will change later on. In Chile, my own country, there was a kind of a survey about the image that the Chilean people have of the church in general. And this was in preparation for a big synod of the Catholic Church. The kind of question was posed in the most popular newspaper. And then several questions, and one was, what image of the church do you have? And it was interesting that the image that was mostly selected by Chilean was, the church is like a 747 Boeing, flying always in good weather above the clouds, without any touch with reality. The real problem of the church will start when the 747 will try to land. Landing, that is the problem. And I think that the church, not only in Chile but in the rest of Latin America, has been trying to land. The church aloof, the church unconcerned with the real human predicament is passing away. and a new church is coming into being. Not homogeneously, not in every place, but yes, the seed is there, and the church is more and more concerned with what is really human. Social analysis has shown us a reality that is sad and terrible. We couldn't imagine that the situation of Latin America was really as bad as it's proved to be. First, Protestant churches, although small in numbers, were ready to start the exploration through the Church and Society Commission. Later on, the Catholic Church became actively involved in many types of analysis due to the Second Vatican Council documents that request the study of those documents in the light of national realities. It's this way that Medellin in 1968 and Puebla in 1979 came about, the Conference of Latin American Bishops, that were able for the first time to introduce in pastoral documents elements of social and political analysis. And if you read those documents, you will find out expression very unusual for ecclesiastical documents. The bishops in Medellin talk about institutional sin, structures of injustice, confessing the sin of the church for being indifferent and aloof, repentance for the church, and as a result, the bishop establishing in a very clear note their preferential option for the poor. Yes, I think that we need to affirm this, the preferential option for the poor, for the oppressed, for those who have been denied their place in society. Not only the poor of money, although those are the most important, but also there are other oppressed people in our continent. Women as being oppressed for too long, and they need to be kind of rescue of their situation, and even better, they need to receive, the right to make their own decisions and to write their own history. We need to be more concerned with people with different sexual orientation. In Latin America, still we do have a tremendous prejudice about homosexuality. Homophobic is not a sin in our midst, it's the natural way of being. How long we are going to tolerate that? It's about time that the church pay serious attention. Not to be obsessed, because sometimes sexual matters can be an obsession for churches like here in the United States. But it's something that we need to recognize as one of the problems. We talk about oppression, then we need to be concerned about people that are being oppressed in different ways. We are seriously concerned with the dimension of suffering. And in this sense also, the conversation that has been going on underline that. Suffering is a mark of our people, the suffering of the people. Yes, in the suffering of the people we see the suffering of Jesus. The face of those children, those elderly, those women that have been abused for so long. We can see the suffering of our Lord that is claiming for a real resurrection. Christian salvation, relates to the search for human fulfillment in our way. So we need to be concerned about that also. At this point, I will just mention briefly, some of the most important contributions that I perceive the liberation theology has been able to make in our world, in the context of Latin America particularly. The first is that Christian faith is not indifferent to the human predicament. Second, social structures are human creation, therefore they can, and in many cases, must be changed. Change must be from the bottom up, not from the top down. Liberation theology has been able to take seriously the eruption of and the participation in the historical process of the poor and oppressed. Again, Gustavo Gutierrez had dealt with this issue very clearly in a very forceful way. Solidarity is a key element in the understanding of the gospel. We have been called to be in solidarity with those who suffer. We have been called in order to stand by those who cannot stand alone. Christian salvation relates in a very serious way to the search for human fulfillment that is going on in Latin America, and the abundance of life that is promised in the gospel here and now is a sign of the coming of the kingdom. So there is no dichotomy between spiritual matters and material matters, but rather we are concerned with the total well-being of humankind. Liberation theology in the Latin American context and in another context has been able to transcend the traditional division between different denominations and different churches. It's very difficult to realize if Gustavo Gutierrez is a Protestant and José Miguel Bonino is a Catholic. People have been puzzled on many occasions, say, but he is a priest? No, he's a minister. And he's a minister? No, he's a priest. Because those differences are irrelevant when you are really dealing with the incarnation of the gospel here and now in order to transform the social, political, and economic condition that make possible, the life of human being. Liberation theology is at the same time learning more and more to be respectful of the cultural diversity of the people. When you work with base Christian communities, you allow the people to express their Christian faith in their own way, in their own culture, with their own language. And this is something good. We have rediscovered the diversity of Latin America. For a while we were under the illusion that we were all more or less equal, that we all speak Spanish. There are more than 400 languages and dialects in Latin America. And we need to allow for that diversity. Yes, we need to respect what they are, because culture is part of what we are. It's not something added. It's part of our being. If we are denied our own cultural expression, we are denied the right to live. It's kind of a cultural and physical genocide, and we need to recognize that. Allow me in a few minutes now to move on quickly to a vision for the future. I hope that we have learned from the past so we will not commit again the mistakes of the past. And obviously here I'm almost paraphrasing Santayana when says, those who ignore history are kind of bound to commit his mistake again. So we need to welcome the diversity that is present in our land, in Latin America as well as in the Pacific Rim. We are diverse, and we welcome this diversity. It will be awful if we will be all equal. Will be boring. I sometimes think about what will the world look like if everybody was just the same. I mean, it's a nightmare. So welcome and rejoice in the diversity. At the same time, we need to be more mindful of the different cultural backgrounds that people have, and in the only way that they can be as cultural entities. We need to recognize the right that people have to express the gospel in their own ways. After all, the gospel is always an interpretation. And in order to interpret the gospel, we need to use cultural wrapping. The problem is, and we give equal importance to the wrapping than to the present that is included in the wrapping. It's about time to allow people to express themselves in the way that they really feel more comfortable, and the gospel will make more sense to them. A more sober understanding of the Christian community is also something that needs to happen in our midst. Yes, we do have a contribution to make, and we are dealing with the theme in this conference, the Christian responsibility. But the Christian responsibility is also to make room for other contribution, for other religion. I remember studying when I was in the theological educational process, comparative religion. But I studied that already knowing that those religions were not as good as mine. So it was something that I need to know as a curiosity. But I was not really existentially involved in trying to understand and to decipher what was the contribution of that particular religion. This was changed when I was very actively involved in peace movement, and I went to Asia, and I learned from my Buddhist friends, brothers and sisters, what really means to be committed for peace, to put your life in line, to walk miles and miles. And I was looking for public transportation, to be there day and night and to be persistent. Then I don't have any right to deny those people the right to speak up, maybe more forcefully than myself, about peace issues. They have gained the right to be heard. And I think that we need to be more humble in our understanding of the contribution of the Christian church and allow different traditions to make their own contribution. This is particularly important in some places in the Pacific where the Christian church is and will remain in the foreseeable future a tiny minority. There is no role for you and for us in those places. Of course we do. We can be a little ferment, a leaven that eventually will transform the whole thing. But in spite of that conviction, we need to be, as I said before, humble. We need to allow other people to make their own contributions together. Working together, we can really make a better future. A common search, a common commitment to the understanding of human nature. It seems to me that will be one way in which we can cooperate together. And why this concern? I'm disturbed, my friend, and this is my last comment. I'm disturbed by the assertiveness of many very conservative, even I will say reactionary people, about human nature. When I try to express some of my visions, they say, but that is very naive. Human beings are not like that. Human beings are greedy, individualistic, hedonistic, selfish. Have you heard that? Then it looks like, gosh, then I'm completely wrong. I'm against everything that is rational here. If we are like that, then it's going to be impossible to do anything different. If the bottom line is always going to be the maximization of profit, we better give up, because maximization of profit, the essence of the capitalistic system, will always demand that some people will be on top and the many will be underneath. Underdevelopment has a very profound definition, that those who are underdeveloped are under those who are developed. Yeah, in that sense, it's true, that many peoples in the world are underdeveloped because the developed ones are on top. So can we find a way in which not maximization of profit, but a more equal distribution of whatever is made, where we can be concerned for the well-being of humankind, where we can really authorize, give permission to everybody to search for her or his best expression of potentialities. This is something that really concerns us, and we need to be diligent in searching together. I know that as Christians, I and you have a responsibility. We believe in a God that has created us, to God's image and likeness. And in the Bible, God is revealed and so is accepted in the Christian tradition, and God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What I perceive to be God the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer of life. And again, what I interpret to be the expression of God's creativity, God's solidarity, and God's responsibility. Creativity, solidarity, and responsibility are mark of our real humanness, part of the image and likeness of God in our own lives. So if we are going to be a responsible human being, we need to kind of allow for the possibility of these three elements, at least, to grow in check and balances together. Creativity, solidarity, responsibility. An irresponsible creativity is detrimental to the solidarity that we are called to have toward all human beings and the rest of creation. I think that we can be proud of the tremendous creativity of science and technology, but how irresponsible in many cases this technology has been used. How it has been used to break the sense of solidarity with other human beings. I think that it's about time that, among other things, we pay attention to this and create the real possibilities in this world for each one of us in the Pacific Rim and in the rest of the world to have the possibilities to become and to remain real human beings willing to make a contribution for the well-being of everybody else. Thank you.
Well, you have heard from the professor, and now here's the driver. I have heard this lecture just as you have, for the very first time, and therefore I hope you will not expect from me a learned response. I think it was a most courageous thing that Professor Gajardo has done to pick up and take over where someone else could not. That's an act of courage, intellectual courage, and I think we must, all of us, demonstrate our appreciation for this. This has been a statement of a man who has learned his theology in the heat of the day, and I think all of us who look on at Latin America, from North America at least, feel a sense of gratitude for liberation theology. I think myself of liberation theology as a theology for those who fell amongst thieves. We are the thieves. How do you develop a theology for thieves? This is our problem. I want to make a few comments, but this is not really a response. I hope that the response will be coming from you. There are two or three things that occurred to me as I listened to the lecture, and you'll have to forgive the fact that they're not put in terribly good order. The first item relates to the plea for unity with which the address began. I think all of us who have grown up in this century of war and enormous divisions at a time when the globe was becoming at the same time smaller through communication understand this plea for unity. I'm a member of the United Church of Canada, which was one of the first union churches in 1925. The Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Methodists of my country came together. United churches, United Nations, we have wanted to have unity. And we dream of this. It's part of the Christian dream, of course. It's the reason why the Emperor Constantine, for one of the reasons why the Emperor Constantine found the Christian religion an interesting thing and became a sort of Christian. Because he saw in this faith a way of bringing together his disintegrating empire. And he's not the first to have noticed that. But the problem is that unity also has a certain danger connected with it, and that is the danger of uniformity. My friend, the Canadian political philosopher, the late George Grant, used to speak about the universal homogeneous state that was coming to be, the technological society, to use the language of Jacques Ellul, which is coming to be, which destroys distinctions, which breaks down local cultures, languages, customs. The struggle that's going on in my own country right now is all about this. Can we stand to have a Francophone minority within our Anglophone majority? Can we allow Quebec to be, and I use the legal phrase now, a distinct society? And most Anglophone Canadians right now are terribly unhappy about that phrase, distinct society. The problem then, how to achieve unity and at the same time to produce and to foster and preserve the uniqueness of local cultures. A second item, I think I have heard in the discussions here, in some of the literature that was sent to us beforehand, something that disturbs me a little bit, I must confess, and that is a kind of Atlantic-Pacific dichotomy. I think I know what's meant when it is said 500 years of Atlantic domination are coming to an end. I certainly hope that 500 years of Atlantic domination are coming to an end, yes. But I think it would be unfortunate if we tried to bring about a greater unity within the Pacific world at the expense of connections with the Atlantic world. For many of us, the Atlantic world is the world of our past, of our heritage, of our ancestry. It's the pond, you know, that my ancestors, at least the Anglo-Saxons amongst them, crossed in order to get here to this continent. I had a few ancestors, by the way, who were here to meet the boat because I have a little bit of saving Mohawk in me. But this represents the past for us, and also for Christians. I mean, for the Christian faith, whether we like it or not, Christianity, in terms of its basic traditions, is a European phenomenon. And we have still to wrestle with this phenomenon. I certainly don't want to sustain the domination of Europe in this. But I have the feeling, talking to many of my European colleagues, such as Moltmann, that they don't want to dominate us anymore anyway. Even Karl Barth, you know, when he was speaking in Chicago, in his only trip to the United States, said in his final remarks, you don't have to be afraid of old Europe. You don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to play second fiddle. You have your own possibilities here. And another aspect of all this is that today, with the sorts of things that have been happening in Europe, we have to do, it seems to me, with a new kind of Europe. Western Europe can be a friend to many of us today who feel, and this will be my third point, who feel some sort of domination coming from the United States of America. We in Canada try to cultivate our relations with Europe, with Britain, the British Commonwealth, with France and the Francophone nations of Europe. We try to cultivate this, many of us, because it is something of a bulwark against a sort of uniform relation with the United States of America. Europe today is not what Europe has been. It's becoming something quite different. I would hate to see, this is what I'm trying to say in this second point, I would hate to see us try to build a new sense of community in the Pacific at the expense of the Atlantic connections. After all, we're talking about one world. And what is the Pacific and what is the Atlantic? It's all water, and it's all connected. And we are connected. And therefore, I'm a little bit uncertain how we are together seeing this concern for the Pacific community. The third item that I would like to mention And I do this because I'm conscious of the fact that there are Americans in this audience. And some of these Americans are people who are very dear to me, by the way. A couple of them have been my teachers in the past, because like many of you, I studied, and many of you who come from other places besides the United States, I have studied theology in the United States for 7 years. I would like to say to the Americans here that the common fear or the common apprehensiveness that some of us have, the two of us, for example, with respect to the American empire, is not directed against the people of the United States of America. I have an enormous respect not only for Americans, but for the institutions of this country. I think one of the great things about the United States of America is its capacity for self-criticism. I think it has a far greater capacity for self-criticism than my country does. And if I ask myself what should be the attitude of those of us who are living on the edge of this empire, and those of us who are somehow apprehensive about this empire, I remember then a statement that was made by the British economist Susan Strange of the London School of Economics, who gave an interesting lecture in my university. I don't know what you'll think of her thesis, but it went like this. In the world, as we've known it, there have always been empires. And probably there always will be. It was kind of, political realism. And at the present time, there's only one empire, there's only one people that is capable of an imperial position in the world, and that is the United States of America. And she went through other countries. I mean, this was before Russia fell apart. And she went through all the other countries and said why they could not fulfill this function in the world. And for her, it was a kind of negative, positive function. I mean, the empire is not just a negative thing, it's also a positive thing. It can do good, empires can do good things in the world. And so she said, what ought to be the attitude of those of us who are basically friendly disposed, so to speak, towards the American empire? And she answered her own question by saying, let us try to help this empire to be a better empire. I think there's a lot of sense in that. And part of what helping the United States of America to be a better empire would mean, in my books, would be supporting the critical element within this country. The self-critical element within this country needs support. I think maybe it's at a low ebb right now. Because during times of apparent triumph of an empire, it's hard for those who are critical of the empire to make their point. I think it would be very important for those of us who are Christians, who are somehow realistic in our political and ethical action, to try to accentuate the positive things that this country, the United States of America, can do in the world. Because it has traditions of justice, of enlightened leadership that can be called upon, that can be evoked, if there's a sufficient vigilance against the imperial pretensions that are also there. Finally, I want to say, well, there is a fourth point about the church. I want to believe with Professor Gajardo that the church can give leadership in the world's search for a unity that does not demand uniformity. But of course this confronts all of us in the church with a tremendous judgment. Yes, I think judgment would have to be the word. Because we are ourselves so completely disunited, ununited. We have not achieved anything like the kind of unity that we would need in order to give leadership to a world that is crying out for greater reconciliation and mutuality. We have not got this ourselves. The ecumenical quest sometimes I think is almost dead in us. And also we are refusing, I think, in all but name, to enter into anything like real dialogue with other religious traditions and other forms of humanism, which we would need to have if we were going to be involved in such leadership. We give lip service to this kind of inter-religious, interfaith dialogue and so forth, but I think a good deal of the time it's a very academic, it's a very theoretical and abstract approach that we're taking. I myself teach in a faculty of religious studies. My own colleagues, with whom I brush shoulders every day, are Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and Islamics. And we are very pleasant to one another. We are very civil. We have tea together every day at 4. But I don't think that we really have begun to think about our responsibility as religions within a threatened world, as religious faiths within a threatened world. This is because in almost every one of us have a certain world ambiguity running through our history. We are not quite sure that as citizens of heaven, and those who are pointing to the other side of the Jordan, as somebody put it, that we should really put our feet down solidly in this world. And until we have decided that this world is really the one that God intends to mend, then we won't really, I think, do very much about its health. Well, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I have been asked to facilitate time for questions. So I realize that it's 9:20, but we will take some questions. I think sitting here for almost 2 hours deserves some participation. Yes.
I was pleased by the speaker's reference to pesticide and broccoli and his unspoken explanation for why George Bush doesn't like broccoli. I also like his reference to the Churchy Flight 747, and I agree with you that the Churchy Flight 747 should come to an end. It is said a conversation between the control tower and the pilot of a 747 Churchy flight went on something like this. Control tower to pilot, please give me your height and position. I repeat, give me your height and position. 5'6", sitting down. And those of us in the flight who aspire to provide an alternative, I think the first thing we need to do is to get our facts right. So without any direct reference to what has been going on tonight, let me just mention 3 or 4. One is ASEAN, that you have mentioned, now has 6 countries. Oil-rich Brunei has joined ASEAN 4 or 5 years ago. And secondly, you refer to the Law of the Sea Treaty. and America's refusal to sign the treaty. I don't know how many of you know who was the chair of the Law of the Sea Committee. It was Professor Tommy Cole. And the height of his diplomatic career was his success in persuading America to sign the treaty. So that's a datum to be checked. And Julia referred to the book that you have, Dragons in Crisis. Sorry?
He signed that treaty?
I'm sure he did. We can check on that. Huh?
Okay.
All right. We'll check on that. But
Would you like to address either one of the speakers directly with any of the questions? Because I think, it is already 9:20 some.
Well, I thought in terms of the...
No, that's fine, but I have been asked to go ahead and facilitate a process of question and answers, and if you have questions, this is the time that I would like for you to ask them. Please go ahead.
I have a question related to both of the speakers. One of the things that worries me most today is the effort of Rome to determine the fate of Latin America. One of you spoke very much of the Medellin Conference and the Puebla Conference. There's to be another conference at Santo Domingo, and Rome is trying to Europeanize this completely. And to me, this is one of the great threats to what might have been a great deal of light in this continent, in this hemisphere.
Would you like either one of them to elaborate on the role of Ratzinger? Maybe Joel can do that.
Yeah, I think that's true, in the sense that the Vatican has been very detrimental to the progress of a more independent elaboration of theology, not only liberation theology, but biblical scholarship and kind of the independent thought of the Catholic Church in Latin America. Since 1974, the Vatican has been very intentional in appointing bishops that are rather conservative, that are impeding, the free movement of some of the most enlightened liberation theologians, have been trying to avoid, some of the religious order that are very active in Latin America to send more missionaries or to control the type of mission work that they can get involved in. So it is true the Vatican is trying desperately to control. And I think that the key issue is not so much, the new way of doing theology that is known as liberation theology, but maybe what Leonardo Boff was able to pinpoint in one of his books, the relationship of power, how the Catholic Church is using power not to enhance people, but in order to suppress, people. And Church, Charisma, and Power was the book that really brought into trouble Leonardo Boff. He has written more radical things before, but at this point was too much for the Vatican to bear. And in regard to the preparatory document for the big fourth consultation of Latin American bishops in Santo Domingo, it's true. The preparatory document is very conservative and has been rejected by many grassroots level organizations, including some powerful priest organizations in Latin America. And there is in the making an alternative document that will be either officially presented or they will run a kind of parallel meeting like was held in Puebla in order to have different voices air in relationship with what is the real role of the church in Latin America. So we are very much aware of the type of promotion that the Vatican is doing, but in spite of this, because, the movement was started not among the hierarchy, but among the people. It is important, the bishops that are appointed, but it's much more important to maintain hope alive, in the people, the Christian-based communities. Because to make a very clear remark about this, once I was in the Dominican Republic, and then one group of North American women were visiting there, and they asked to other women that present a kind of local project. The question was, what the church is doing, does the church support you? And then the Dominican woman repeat what they were doing. And the question was again repeated, but the church is approving what you are doing. And then it dawns on the Dominican woman that there was a different conception of the church. The woman from North America was asking if the hierarchy was behind the program, and the woman in the Dominican Republic said, well, we are the church, and we are involved in this project. Therefore, the church is involved. Now, if you are asking me for the bishop, if the bishop wants to be with us,
that's really good for us and for the bishop. If he doesn't want to be with us, too bad for the bishop. And that is the new concept. So if the Pope wants really to move everything, the clock of history, just kind of appointing conservative bishop, I think that will delay the process, but will not stop it. Yes, there's another question.
Go ahead.
I once attended a conference last year, and the main speaker was a political scientist, and he was talking about this idea of what our respondents said about the unification, as it were, of the whole world. I don't know what words they used, but and after he had spoken, I stood up and I was trying to mention the fact that I think that, see, I come from Africa, and I want to emphasize pluralism and the importance of where I'm coming from and other cultures like Latin America and so on and so forth. But this speaker was so adamant about the fact that these things are just superficial, and there's a common movement, which is a technological culture that is going to, as it will, override all these things that we talked about. I did not make him aware that I'm a theologian, because I had to hide, because almost all the political scientists who were there at the meeting felt that these ideas of little cultures here, little cultures there, and so on are just a facade, and there's a main technological movement that is going to unify the whole world and bring it together. Now, I'm talking about people who are real heavy-duty professors in their fields and written a lot. And fortunately or unfortunately, there were other scientists there. I know one of them was a professor in chemistry, and who also kind of really agreed with the political scientists. And I really felt that when I go to theological conferences, what is said seems to be so different from what these other people are saying. And I'm just wondering, now these are not just kids, they are people who are really heavy-duty professors who are studying so hard in their own field.
I don't mean to be unpolite or anything
No,
like
but the
that,
question goes
but I would
to-
like for you to address directly your question to either one of them in regards to what they have
The
said.
question actually goes to both of them, because our respondent raised up that issue about somebody in his school who had also talked about this unification.
What is your question?
My question is this: if these people, these political scientists, are right in what they are saying, where do we as theologians fit in? Unless we as theologians maybe want to say, well, we hear them, but they cannot be right. I'm seeing that as a real big issue. And I guess that's why our respondent raised it up. Because if there is one whole huge big culture, technological culture, that is going to override everything, then I'm just wondering.
Is your question related to the relationship between theologians and other disciplines?
My question is related to the fact that our main speaker had raised the issue about unity and unification. And our respondent raised that up as an issue that is very important. And I'm just saying that if what these political scientists are saying is true, then where do we fit in? Because I thought our respondent would maybe want to talk more about that. I think it's a very important issue.
Okay, this time is not to elaborate more or anything. We are just asking questions directly to the content of the response. John, you want to say anything on that?
Maybe I will jump here in the sense that if I understood John correctly, and he can speak up after, but I think that is not kind of a different, there is no contradiction. I mentioned the search for unity, but never mentioned the word unification or kind of homogeneity. I think I celebrate diversity, and I try to make that very clear. So what I'm looking for and where we can kind of put our minds and heart together is to find ways for mutual cooperation, but without blurring, any particular distinction. The respect for our identity. I suffer in this all the time. I'm Hispanic, and I don't want to forget about that. Sometimes people say, oh, you are Hispanic, but you don't look like it's a big compliment. I said, too bad, because I am one. I can learn other cultures in the same way that I can try at least to learn other languages. But still, my language is Spanish, my culture is very much identified, with Hispanic America and things like that. So I don't want uniformity. That's why I reject the sociological concept of melting pot. The world is not going to be a melting pot. People don't melt. I don't melt, and you don't. So we will never be kind of one kind of different product what we are. So we need to find ways to cooperate, but respecting, our differences, and even celebrating our differences. I think that is possible. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I mentioned before that this is a kind of unsurmountable task. Nevertheless, we will never know that it's that tough if we don't try. Let's keep trying. But it's not that I want to create a uniformity. And even technology. I'm not for just the quote-unquote modernization of the world and everybody having access to the same type of technology. I think that technology can be very disruptive. Technology is born out of the given social and cultural context. And when it's exported, and that's one of the problems of the world, when it's exported, create a lot of conflicts and tensions, not only with new machinery, but even television, kind of people that don't have any idea how it is possible for television to work have access to the television, and that distorts all the cultural background that they do have. So I'm not preaching or asking for a kind of technological world that will be homogeneous all over, but rather a way of cooperating, accepting that we are different, and in spite of our difference, we have a common human vocation, so to speak, to which we need to address. John, I don't know.
Yes, I want to say something. Yes, I did not raise that question as if it were a distinction or a difference between the two of us. No, I was simply holding it up as a problem. It's important for us all to think about unity in the world. This is obvious. But there's a kind of unity which destroys individuality and distinctness. And there's another kind of unity which preserves this. And we Christians ought to know something about the distinction between these two kinds of unity. That's all.
I'm going to exercise my role here, and we'll have 3 more questions because I see a number of hands being raised. Go ahead.
I'd like to address a question to Professor Paul. Would you just elaborate that that U.S. and the people, individuals, and some institutions have sense of justice? Would you elaborate that more? Yes, whatever you said, I should.
Well, that's a very big question. But all I was intending to say at that point was that in this country, in the United States of America, there are traditions of justice. There are traditions of fairness and law and consideration and mercy. There are many traditions in this country that can be drawn upon by people who wish that this country would be what it can be. Do you have trouble with this, Owen? Well, why?
As far as your white Anglo-Saxon, you can say that. But don't you see here some people who are present here in this room?
Yes, and I think that many of those people have drawn upon these same traditions of justice.
Is that kind of justice, has it been really applied to the whole people?
No, of course not. I'm not saying that it has